Good afternoon, everybody. What a fantastic morning it was. If you're just joining us for this afternoon, either here or joining us from home as well, well, you're in for a great afternoon as well. So we spent this morning, I think, really just learning about coming to terms with the scale of the challenge ahead of us. This afternoon is really going to start diving into what are some very practical examples, very practical experiments that are taking place right now that can be part of the bridge to that future. My name's Kieran Boyle. I'm the Chief Executive of Guy's and St Thomas's Foundation. And I would just like to check everybody's energy levels, because some of you have just come back from lunch. So could you just give me, are you low, are you mid, or are you high at the moment? It's okay, in between. All right, so let's, well, we can raise that. So, actually, could I just ask these three people just on the edge here, could you just stand up? Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so that's about the scale of foundation assets in the UK. Can I ask everybody on the front row to stand up? Okay, so these are the assets that government in the UK can bring to bear. Can I ask everybody else to stand up? This is the scale of capital markets in the UK as well. So I just want to kind of everybody sit down, thank you. Just to kind of start to put into context what we're going to discuss today around collaboration and how we can bring different types of financial actor together. I'm really delighted that we're going to be led through this conversation by Caroline, the Chief Executive of ESME Foundation, by Sarah Teacher from the Impact Investing Institute, by Maria from Legal and General Investment Management, and by Ivana from the Transcap Initiative. So what we're discussing is how organisations, including foundations, businesses and government organisations, can use their convening power to bring together different kinds of assets, capital and investment, centred on a shared mission that goes beyond any one individual organisation. So it's going to be a great discussion. What we're going to do, if it's all right with you, is we're going to give you this weird amount, 7 minutes. 7 minutes to set out how you think about a finance ecology. Perhaps you could say a little bit about your work. And if you could really also, just within that, try and give us some really very practical examples of what you've seen work or not seen work, or what you could imagine working in the future as well. I'm going to start with Caroline before moving to Sarah. So, Caroline.
Hello, everyone. I hope if anyone who missed this morning, honestly, you should watch it. It was absolutely mesmerising. It was so interesting. I ran out of ink writing so much. So I'm the Chief Exec at the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, and I just wanted to run through how we think about money, capital. So for us, money is, I just think part of the problem of this world, is that we've created money as this sort of holy grail, this amazing thing. Actually, it's a mechanism. It's just a mechanism for getting stuff done. So, and it has different properties in the way that, if you want to buy a house, it's different from if you want to bet your money on horses, or there are different ways that you can use this money. And so at the Esme Fairbairn Foundation, we used to be a grant maker. That's what we did. We gave out grants, and our endowment, and to be fair, we had our social investment kind of pot of money, but that had nothing to do with our grant making. It was completely separate. And then we had our endowment over here, which had absolutely, like when I arrived at Esme, we didn't even have exclusions. Like there was absolutely nothing. So, and what we've transitioned over to thinking of it, and I think different people call it different things, but it's that idea of a spectrum of capital. So you go from grant making all the way to public equities and everything in between. And they're all just mechanisms and tools that you can mix and match and use to get the right outcome. And that's the second thing that we've done, is being much more specific about the outcomes that we want to see. We don't have expertise in health, for example, but we have really a lot of expertise in the environment and our natural world. So we've done the work of saying, where is it that we have expertise and legitimacy, and then how can we use all of these tools to try and all of these different financing tools. And so I just wanted to give some examples of some of the, the other thing to say is that we now don't do anything on our own. We do everything in partnership with others. And that's the new rule. And not necessarily in the not-for-profit space either. So we call it, we need to start being part of unusual alliances, we call them, where we have people from different sectors and different bits of the economy, all trying to kind of bring them together to try and do things differently. So a couple of examples. One is our work in the Wyre Valley, and that was a collaboration with Triodos Bank, DEFRA, and the Environment Agency to bring in, to start thinking about natural flood management in a particular area that was really badly flooded, and the community was really, really suffering. And we brought together the farmers, the water utilities, the community, to try and work out how we could get a revenue model out of that. So who benefited from better outcomes out of this if we wanted to stop the flooding and also use natural flood management to do that? Oh, and the local authority, obviously. And obviously, that took quite a long time. It took about 2 years to do that. But what happened as a result of that initial grant funding is that it then has now moved into a social investment that's raised £1 million of investment capital. Now, that's not huge, as you said, in the grand scheme of things, but actually our role is to show that these different types of financing mechanisms that involve lots of different players but are absolutely grounded in real environmental and social outcomes can be investable. And ideally then, the next time this happens, people might raise £2 million or £5 million. So it's that job of, as we were talking about earlier, creating these catalytic changes and then ideally they get taken up. Another example is, again, again, this is more grant funding, but it's linked to then an investment option. So there's a nature-friendly farming network, which started out as a tiny group of a few farmers, and it is now really growing, providing support for farmers who want to transition across to a kind of agroecology way of working. But linked to that is a learning network, but also linked to that is a loan structure that we have with the Rivers Trust, where for smaller farmers, where they need to invest in the transition, but they're not big enough to be able to raise that money, that equity from anywhere else. So we provide the loan, the Rivers Trust, we delegate it to the Rivers Trust to lend that money to these smaller farmers and then have a recycled loan fund. We sit as an observer and we sit to listen and learn so that we then can develop the next stage of it. So those are just some of the tangible examples about how we're using all those different types of funding mechanisms. And in our endowment, we are definitely pushing towards a transition to responsible investing, where any new fund coming in has got to meet certain criteria. We're not getting it quite right now, but we're also then looking at how can we bring in the expertise from our grant making and our social investment in by working with our investment advisors to kind of link those two things together. So the investment decisions that we get made and the way that we're working with them is that as an advisory firm, we are pushing them very, very hard and really working well with them to kind of take the knowledge and expertise that we have in certain areas into the way that they do their due diligence. So there's all sorts of
scales to that.
Yeah.
Well, I love the idea of those unusual alliances. I guess one big question is, like, why do they have to feel unusual to us? Like, what has led to that feeling an unusual an unusual thing. I might move to Sarah, if I may. So, Sarah, people might not know about the Impact Investing Institute, so perhaps you could say a word about that. But you've spent a career moving between the corporate philanthropic sector, and so I just wondered if you could share your perspectives of how these tribes may work together.
Well, I hope I can shed some light, but firstly to say thank you so much for having me, and very happy to be here. And I just wanted to reflect first on that finance ecology language, which I just think is so interesting and typically exact language from this conference, which I really appreciate, because it's the interrelationship between these different investor types, communities and places that is such a vital piece of the puzzle of building a fairer, sustainable economic model. And I think you've heard this morning about the need to work together better. And you could hear in Caroline's examples, you know, taking the time to understand different incentives and the different needs of different capital holders and come together to create common solutions. And these are solutions that have historically prized the investor voice above others, at the exclusion of others. And now we need to spend a lot more time and attention listening to and incorporating the perspectives of those who've been unheard. So that's communities writ large, but particularly, for example, communities of colour, or in this country, left behind regions, or places that have really struggled post-industrialisation or deindustrialisation. So convening is right at the heart of that. And, you know, from my experience starting in philanthropy and then working in corporate consultancy and then into investment management and now in the Impact Investing Institute, these people rarely talk to each other. No one goes to work thinking they're the bad guy. So part of the essence of this conference, of convening, is to get those groups talking together. And at the Impact Investing Institute, where I sit now, with our mission to make capital markets fairer and work better for people and planet, convening different groups across different sectors, across different investor groups in places is core to our approach. And I should also say, is an evolving body of work. And it's new territory, and we're learning all the time. So I'll just touch on two concrete examples of where we're trying to do this, thinking about bringing people together in different ways. So our first is our work in place-based impact investing. And this started with two distinct investment groups. This is how we thought about it initially, bilaterally. So we started with the local government pension scheme, which is £326 billion of assets under management from, you know, someone who's worked in adult social care in Manchester their whole life and has been paying into their retirement. And we wrote a white paper which looked at where those £326 billion were invested. And it surfaced that only 300 million of the 326 billion was invested in what we described as UK place-based opportunities. So that was renewable energy, SME investing, urban regen, infrastructure, those kind of initiatives. And, you know, for the person who works in adult social care in Manchester and who's lived there their whole lives, they actually might be quite interested that their pension is invested for positive impact locally, still providing them with their retirement, still meeting a risk-adjusted market rate return, but ultimately kind of doing good in their backyard. So that was the first stream, local government pension scheme, but still bilateral. And on the second scheme, we worked with Lloyds Banking Group, and we looked at how they, as a UK bank, could better relate to places to ensure that the places that got financed, or the assets that got financed locally, were ones that the local authority and communities wanted. And we did that work in Leeds, Liverpool and Birmingham. But in this next chapter of work, for Caroline, it's unusual alliances. For us, it's called coalitions in place. So it's about bringing all of those people around the table that have common set of interest in a place and differentiated incentives. A pension fund has a different set of needs to a charitable foundation, that has a different set of needs to social investors, that has a different set of needs to communities. And it's about bringing those groups together to try and work through all of that complexity. So our first pilot is in Wakefield. We're extremely excited about it. And there we had our first meeting, and which was brilliant. The chief executive is fantastic. He brought together all of these enterprises, local anchor institutions, that I assumed would all know each other. And even in that first meeting, the local anchor enterprises, none of them had spoken to each other. And within 2 hours, the group had started to work together to understand, well, if we put this together with that, you know, your production park together with our arts facility together with this housing unit, if we presented that to investors, suddenly we have an investable opportunity that a pension fund could get behind. But the pension fund can't get behind it by itself. It needs to come in coalition, in unusual alliance with other investors. So that's on place. A relational, ecological way of working that we think will yield better outcomes overall. So perhaps I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you. So you mentioned pension funds. So I might move to Maria. So Maria, if we're going to shift systems, kind of helps you've got £2 trillion behind you. So perhaps
I wish they were mine.
Perhaps you could talk about, from a pension fund perspective, how you think about systems, how you think about shifting within them, and how you think about coalitions, which are a key part of legal and general investment management's approach to things.
Yep. I'll try and do that. Thank you so much for having me here. It's been delightful, and I think the morning has been really, I've learned a lot already this morning, so it's been fantastic. So I thought what I would do is I'll take one step back just to give you a flavour for the work that we do, and in particular within the stewardship team where I work at Legal and General Investment Management. So the purpose of our team is to protect our clients' assets through raising market standards and best practice. We have a responsibility not just to our clients, but also to the market and broader society. So it's within this context that we operate. For us, this means so if I take that into the ESG space or the stewardship space, for us, it's not only about risk management and sort of risk and return. It's about risk, return, and impact. So, and how can we do this? It helps, as Kieran said, having 1.4 trillion as assets under management, it helps getting yourself heard. We are what many classify and what we would say a universal owner. That means that we hold at least one share, usually much more, in every single listed company. That means, as a shareholder, we have a right to speak to the company and hence have a seat at the table, and that's really important. And what does that mean? We can have a seat and we can be there silent. We don't do that. We talk to the company and challenge the company, and that's two components. We're not just asking for information, we also challenge the company. How do we do that? We have several themes that we work against. So that is income inequality, diversity, obviously climate change, and health. And because I lead on our health theme, I'll give you a couple of examples from that, because I think that it's slightly easier to do that. So under our health theme, but obviously it's connected to other themes as well. Diversity, it would be income inequality, climate change. But so within the health theme, we have two sub-themes. One is nutrition, and that's particularly focusing on obesity, and AMR, that's antimicrobial resistance. Now, why do we focus on these two themes? As an investor, if we keep that in the back of our mind. So when it comes to obesity, the World Health Organization has estimated that about 40% of the US adult population is obese. A recent House and Commons report indicated that in England, so not the UK, in England, 28% of the adult population can be classified as obese, and 1 in 4 of 11-year-olds, that's 25%, are obese. That's a significant impact on the communities, but also on the health expenditures of countries. So to give a relationship to that, what that means is OECD estimates that 8% of OECD countries' health budgets for the next 30 years will be needed to be used to deal with the consequences of that. And if you look at AMR, and I'm giving you this context and then I'll say if you look at AMR, so antimicrobial resistance is a recent study that was published this year, had done an extraordinary amount of work looking at 2019 on how many deaths can directly be related to bacterial antimicrobial resistance. So to put it in layman terms, you couldn't use antibiotics. There were no antibiotics available for that person to treat an infectious disease, and hence that person died. That's 1.27 million deaths per year in 2019. The projections that were estimated already in 2014 were that number will become 10 million deaths per year. If you cast your mind back, or in the present, if you think of COVID, we have about 6.6 million deaths due to COVID over 2.5 years. And if you think, then again, what has the impact been on our work, on our daily lives, on job opportunities, loss of opportunities, etc., that's significant. And that context this is why we deem those, as systemic risks, but also extremely important that we work on these risks. And so what we do is, in our conversations with companies, we will talk to them about this risk, but also challenge them. Part of the work, some of the work that I do with Kieran's colleagues is on nutrition and how, for example, products are marketed to children. It will be the mandatory reporting that we think should be in place for food and beverage companies, starting in the UK, but also something globally. And that's linking it back to universal owners. That is that allows us to work on a global level with all companies. And in that context, what's also important, it's the conversation we have with companies, but also with policymakers and regulators. And so we have this two-pronged approach of companies and also trying to influence policymakers. And in an additional layer to that is the work we do collaboratively with other investors, but also with other stakeholders. Guy's and St. Thomas being one example, Share Action being another, working with faith-based communities in the US when it comes to slightly separate, but an area we also cover is the opioid pandemic in the US. And so using all those levers to enable a shift or a change in society. And so just, do I have time? Can I make very small? So come and ask me afterwards, because we have an interesting way of how we can use that within specific fund ranges and change how we provide capital to these companies. That's one point. And the last point, I want you to think about who is your pension provider? A bit coming back to what Caroline and Sarah was saying. Think about who is your pension provider. If you know who it is, challenge them. If it's us, please challenge us. But if it's somebody else, challenge them. Are they really doing what they're saying that they're doing? Are they voting the shares that they hold on your behalf? And if you don't know, find out today and challenge them. I'll end on that note.
Thank you. Yeah. It's all our money.
Exactly. It is.
Well, perhaps Ivana, we can move to you and the work of TransCap Initiative in helping people find routes to these sorts of coalitions and towards this sort of scale. Perhaps you could sketch that out for us.
So we're a lot more on the experimental side of things than anyone else on this panel, but TransCap Initiative really started out as a project inside Climate Kick a few years ago. And Climate Kick, as many of you know, is Europe's largest climate innovation agency. And I think it arose out of a question that Climate Kick was asking itself, but fundamentally I think they were not alone. And the question was sort of, we're all running these big projects, they're really ambitious, we're working really hard, and suddenly you realize single projects don't change systems. So this was a whole bunch of kind of nonprofits and other organizations were in this space pondering this. And I think at the time, Climate Kick asked the question of what happens if you aim for systems transformation by working across a number of different levers, of which capital flow is a key one. And so that's how TransCap was really born. Today, we're an independent organization. We've spun out. We're an open innovation space. And we call it kind of a marriage between systems thinking and finance, which, that's an interesting and kind of uncomfortable marriage, really, a lot of the time. Because obviously the traditional finance orthodoxy of today and systems thinking is in many ways fundamentally at odds. But we're coming at this work from a kind of perspective of, and I'm sure we all agree on this, but the challenges we're facing are just so vast and so complex and so acute that in order to crack them through capital flows, we need a radically different way of investing. And that's the premise of TransCap, is to very deliberately and explicitly work on systemic transformation through financial portfolios. So what I mean by this, I guess, is if I, as an investor today, want to make a sustainable investment, let's say, I might have a few options open to me. So one of those is I could invest in a listed ESG fund. I might invest in a project like a wind farm development, let's say. I could invest in a sustainable startup. But the unit of analysis tends to be still around individual technologies, individual companies. The way that success is framed is still around sort of picking a winner, or maybe picking a few winners, as the case may be, achieving a competitive return, and also achieving stated social or environmental impact on the side, or both. And what we want to do is kind of flip that on its head almost. So our experiment is about taking a very mission-driven approach to investing. So instead of starting with a profit imperative or starting with an ESG framework, the starting point is really what is the challenge, what is the need in the real economy? And then as an investor, you structure your mission around that. And then how you build your portfolio and deploy your capital is fundamentally about making investments, however small they might be, or big, that have an outsized impact on and are sort of working in service of that mission. So that's the kind of essential premise. And our ambition is really to make this the kind of new finance orthodoxy for sustainable investing, essentially, an alternative to what there is out there in the mainstream. The way we're working with it in practice on the ground right now is kind of twofold. One is that we recognize that the thing that's missing is that there are no methodologies, legal structures, decision-making frameworks, capabilities that sort of correspond to this. And so part of what we're doing is kind of theoretical and conceptual in that we're building system change tools and frameworks that are geared towards finance practitioners that can help kind of enable them to do work in this way, and building community around that, and also storytelling. So telling effective stories about systemic investing in order to help enable that mindset shift. But the second way that we're working is much more practical. So we're trying to bridge the gap between theory and practice, because of course, at the end of the day, everyone wants to know, where's the money going to land? What does systemic investing mean in practice? Does it work? So we're building systemic investment portfolios. So right now we're doing one in Switzerland, which is all about structuring an investment vehicle for net zero mobility in Switzerland. And we're doing that with a finance partner. We're doing the system mapping, identifying the leverage points for transformation in that market, understanding the investable universe, structuring what I think necessarily has to be a multi-asset class investment vehicle. But then also, unusually, we're a nonprofit, but we're going to carry on working with the financial partner on identifying the deal flow, doing the due diligencing, being part of the investment committee, so the decision-making bit of it. And then finally, making sure that the investment vehicle is actually situated within a wider ecology of other activities that are happening around this space. So obviously, financial capital is just one lever, right? And so how do you work with other non-financial partners on addressing some of the other leverage points for transformation in the mobility space? So I'll just stop there.
Thank you. I love the idea of starting with the mission as well.
Yeah.
Certainly that's something that we're trying to do at Guys and St Thomas Foundation. I think one of the things we've really captured from that, for us it's a health mission, is actually how much quicker you learn when you have that clarity of the why of your endowment. So I guess like the risk of having asked you to give very practical examples is this all sounds quite easy. And like, cool. But I suspect it's not. So I just, please jump in, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is difficult about pulling these unusual alliances together. And if you may on that, one particular question I've got is about values. We spent a lot of this morning, I think, touching on values, and I just wondered whether values is something that comes into the equation, something that you deliberately try and keep out of it as well. So perhaps you can kind of pick up anybody on those areas. Caroline.
Okay, so I think there are two or three things around that. One is that we started looking at investment, social / impact investing about 15, 20 years ago. Our first investment was actually into Charity Bank. So we sort of built up, and our primary driver is that we are an impact first investor. And as you say, you start with the outcomes that you're trying to achieve, and then you design the financial solution to make that work. Always checking to make sure that the investment and the finance model is in lockstep with the outcomes and the impact. But we learned over years and years of trying all sorts of different things, and we've invested in co-ops, in funds, in for-profit organisations, and so we've built up, and I have a small team who are extremely expert in this. Alongside that, also have a team who are the grant funding team, who are incredibly expert at their in the particular issues. So I think we were very fortunate that we could know which were the areas that we could approach, or we had the expertise and the knowledge. And I think our role as a foundation, the independence that we have, the brokering role that we can play, we're not trying to raise money. We can't have a kind of political agenda. So that independence is hugely helpful. And our role was about anchoring the kind of coalition and persuading people to come on board. So I think that was a different kind of, approach. But finally, we're really, really strong on the fact that if we are to underwrite this sort of thing, we have a really big say what it does. So we're not just going to underwrite something. We are going to make sure that our job is to keep impact right on the table. And it is but as I said, it took 2 years to bring that coalition together to structure something, a new investment vehicle. It took 2 years and a lot of toing and froing, a lot of kind of understanding what, we think all the time, how can we unlock, what's the role that we can play to unlock the thing that's stopping it from happening? And we've done all sorts of things, but that was our role, again, not keep impact on the table and make sure that we're always providing that sort of unlocking mechanism to keep it going. Yep. But it takes a long time and it's intensive.
So time,
patience,
intensiveness, Ibity.
Technical term.
What else? So, like, very practically, what do people need to be able to overcome if they're going to get to these alliances?
I think there's some sort of quite basic practical things. The space of convening is invaluable. So we did this project as part of this initiative called the Impact Task Force last year, where we convened lots of people from mainstream finance around defining what just transition financing was. And I think spending the time to come up with that shared vision that everyone buys into is really, really helpful. So we selected these kind of 3 broad buckets of climate action, socioeconomic equity and distribution, and community voice. And that convening and that sort of intellectual framing has now become the foundation of something called the Just Transition Finance Challenge, where asset owners, asset managers, local investors, development finance institutes are signing up to start to think about integrating these agreed criteria that they signed off together into vehicles. And, you know, it's a constant work in process, and bringing in community voice, other key players will be a part of the next chapter, but spending the time co-creating that vision in a neutral convening place, it really chimes with, you know, the work Caroline's been leading in a very different, you know, in a different place. So I think there's a lot of commonality there.
If I could add just something briefly, I think in practical terms, we're going to need more novel and hybrid vehicles than we have today.
Definitely.
So still traditionally, we have these spaces which are a bit siloed. You know, you're either granting, or you're a VC, or you're in private equity. And actually, if you think about systems change, you're going to need all of that and then some. You're going to need to create new kinds of venture enterprises, so you're going to need VCs to do that work. Sometimes it's not going to be investable. You might need some catalytic funding or granting. Sometimes it's not even about money.
Yes,
so
definitely true.
I think that we need to sort of imagine and bring those new structures into being, because right now we mostly don't have them, I think.
I agree.
I'll just add a small point. And going back a bit to the conversations this morning, I would say it's a lot about language and understanding each other and getting a bit what you were saying, Sarah, of the convening space and getting the right people into the room. And maybe also sometimes not the right people, or what you think are the right people might not be the right people. So it's getting, and I think if I represent sort of the investor, I think it is important for us to get a lot more people into the room and consider the like all stakeholders. It could be our stakeholders as the pension provider, but also the stakeholders of our companies or the beneficiaries, the end beneficiaries companies into the room. So it's having those conversations. But I think it goes a lot back to, are we understanding each other's languages and just taking a minute to understand the other? That is what I would say.
So it still sounds, I'm going to push you all here, it still smells pretty easy.
Because
you said be intentional, spend time doing it, create spaces, understand each other's language, but we all do that. We try to do that. We know how to do that. So I'm going to push you all a bit further. Why doesn't more of this happen?
So I'm going to be slightly controversial here, because I always, whenever I'm faced with these taxonomies and these frameworks from the financial services systems all the time, and so people talk about the just transition, but who gets to decide what a just transition looks like? Because none of these frameworks talk to people fundamentally who are at the bottom of the rung, who are being treated totally unjustly. And I think a lot of these things, they lack the grit in the oyster, which is absolutely saying, I don't understand what you're talking about, because actually what I care about is my bus service, and what I care about is that the waiting list is huge, and what I care about is that my school is falling apart and my granddaughter can't get to work. And so I worry that we're talking up here when the reality is down here. And that financial services love a framework. They love something that can be counted and ticked off, as I said right at the beginning. And funds, for example, are absolutely catastrophic models for impact. They just are, because they are structured to mitigate risk. They're structured to basically find winners. Yeah, 2 winners and the rest, that's fine. They're structured to kind of, in a way that's very short term. So you get the money in over 2 years, you spend it over 4 or 5 years, and then you wind down and you start up another one. And the financing incentives of them are shocking. So the current financial, you're right, we need new products which are incentivized differently, they're structured differently, they take input from totally different audiences. And I don't think that conversation is really happening at the level that it needs to happen. And I think there's a huge resistance to it as well, to be absolutely honest.
Thank you. Now we're going to go. Sarah, how does that conversation...
Thanks, Caroline. You're welcome, Sarah, anytime.
How does that conversation happen?
I think that, I completely hear what you're saying. And I think that the system itself needs to be taken on a journey, and there are some funders, for example pension funds, who have very serious restrictions on what they can do, and for good reason. They're paying out people's pensions in 50 years' time, and I think I'm more optimistic in potentially in bringing together different investor groups, foundations, social investors, pension funds, impact-minded PE funds, etc., to try and bring that constellation of individuals that maybe can round out some of that risk-return issue. And hopefully, by spotlighting on these exemplars, we can encourage others to do the same and push the whole field forward. But I agree, we're working with the most high-minded, committed, impact elements of the mainstream, and I'm aware that there are others who, have been completely untouched by the impact investing movement. But I think, hopefully, through some good mixed exemplars, we can push things forward.
We're having to draw to a close soon, but we've got time. Perhaps for one final question, which is, what are you hopeful? What are you hopeful for? And so, Maria, perhaps we could start with you, and then just work towards Caroline.
I think, after what Caroline said, I don't know what sorry. No, but I do, well, maybe because I am optimistic, I do think that it is a lot about the dialogue and getting that input. I think I would getting that input, but it also is, and I think a bit what you were saying, Sarah, there is constraints on our clients. If I look specifically on LGIM, on what they can and cannot do, and what we can and cannot do because of the provision of the pension in 10, 30, but also 50 and 75 years down the line. What helps us, and what specifically helps us in the stewardship team, is the questions that clients, i.e. you guys, ask. What are you pushing for? What do you want to see that your pension money does? And that does make a difference.
So hopeful for the questions that are going to be asked
yes.
of you. Ivana?
Well, I think I'm hopeful that someone's going to come and seriously disrupt the investment space in a way that's competitive to the mainstream. Yeah. And that, I'm not so vain as to think that's going to be Transcap. It might well be somebody else. But that is, I think, what I'm hopeful for. And also that, I guess the second thing would be on a higher level, that we open up the conversation about returns in the future and what that's going to look like. Because I think that's part of the elephant in the room. I don't know what part of the elephant it is, but it's kind of like, every day another climate fund launches, and it sets out all these expectations, outsized impact, outsized returns. It's like, are the returns always going to be outsized, or do we need to kind of level set our expectations about that in the future, particularly if we're gearing towards more mission-led investing?
Thank you, Sarah.
I think I'm hopeful, and I'm going to throw this back to Caroline and Kieran, because of some of the foundation movements around investing for impact in the endowment. In the UK, there's £72 billion worth
of investments in the capital markets, that if they start to reflect on how they can play in the capital markets in a new way to advance impact, can start to really bring forward some of these exemplars that I hope will be part of the solution to the problems that Caroline outlined. So I hope for the foundations in the room, you're starting to grapple with these themes as Guy's and Esme are so interestingly.
Thank you. Caroline?
So I'm really hopeful. I mean, I really think something has to flip. It just has to flip. And so if some of the new products that we develop, that we're designing and developing, and these new unusual alliances start shifting the deep cultural kind of norms within the financial services system, then I'm really hopeful that that is beginning to happen, and that it has to happen. So I'm hopeful.
Conversations like this make me hopeful too. Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating panel. Can we thank our panellists?
Thank you so much. Beginning to see some real themes coming through. That echo of the previous conversation about transdisciplinary work and relational work, or shared intent, and also when thinking about system transformation, not looking to back a winner, but instead to fund lots of things. We've got one more panel before we take a break, and this time we're moving on to look at how to shift resources to the places they need to go. So democratizing wealth, shifting economic control back to communities, and some more really fascinating case studies and exemplars that people are going to be talking about on the panel. I'm really happy to have Amir Rizwan from Big Society Capital, who's going to be chairing this panel for us. So yeah, enjoy the next session, and then we'll have a break.
Very
you get
cozy.
together?
Yeah, very
That's
cozy.
Nice. Hi everyone. Hope you're awake from lunch. You know how it is presenting after lunch and the post-lunch drop down. So hopefully we're going to try and make this as exciting as possible. We are going to have two people join us on the screen because this is going to be a transatlantic conversation. So we've got two people joining us from America who should be on the screen shortly. Hello. Hi there. Can you hear us okay? Okay, wonderful. Technology works. So my name is Amir Rizwan. I think Ali in the previous session claimed, he was born in Iran. So I'm the second Iranian at this conference. This is a big step for representation for the Iranian community. You never get two in one conference. This is like a rarity. Treasure it. So we've been tasked by Sophia and Cassie to really root our conversations into the more practical elements of how this work can happen at the local level. And I'm really, really excited to have four great people here to talk about the fantastic work that they're doing, both in the UK and in the US, around shifting the power and the use of financial instruments to really, really kind of, I think, synthesize all the various discussions that have happened so far. So we've heard a lot about the themes, the kind of like really big discussions about the need. And what I'm hoping with our superstar panel is that we really talk about the practicalities of how this work can happen, and also the role in which financial instruments can play in kind of helping this. So I'm going to kind of leave it there for now. I was going to go and ask our individual presenters to present themselves and talk about kind of a bit about who they are and their organization before we delve into some topics and conversations. So if I could start off with you, Matthew, do you want to go ahead?
Sure, thanks very much. And firstly, thanks very much for JRF for organising such a fantastic session. I'm Matthew Lawrence. I'm the founder and director of a think tank called Commonwealth, which, as the name suggests, is interested in practices of commoning, of the commons, of democratizing ownership. And in particular, we're sort of interested not just, I suppose, in the redistribution of wealth, but the reimagination of how we generate wealth in the first place. So not just a redistribution of the present, but the reimagination of the future on new values of active inclusion, of reparation, of democracy. I wanted to just sort of tee up really sort of two themes of our work and practice of our work from the sort of systemic to the granular, which then I hope we'll be able to get into deep conversation in, around the type of financial instruments, the type of mechanisms which currently allocate but can transform in a more sort of inclusive direction wealth and power. So one of our first areas is sort of the rise of what we call asset manager capitalism. So these vast behemoths, BlackRock, Vanguard in particular, that own tens of trillions of dollars worth of assets in the global economy, huge allocative power in terms of where wealth is directed, and with that, enormous power over things like how we respond to the climate emergency, how we tackle economic inequality, how we try and undo and abolish many of the sort of structural oppressions that lace through our economies. And while in some ways they're real mechanisms for many of the problems we're wrestling with today around concentrations of wealth and power, embryonic in them, there are vehicles of new forms of collective wealth holding, new forms of democratization of wealth and capital at scale. And so I think there's some, sort of almost jiu-jitsu moves there to think about how we can use existing financial instruments to reimagine the future. And then on a much more granular scale, we also work with communities across the UK, from Plymouth to the Isle of Skye to Bradford to Tottenham, around this model that we call public common partnerships. So this is, as the name suggests, kind of an antithesis of public-private partnerships, a sort of cookie-cutter model of extractive economic development. And instead, the PCPs are about thinking through at a granular scale, and so various business models from community businesses to cooperatives, how we can common local assets and resources, whether it's kelp fields in Skye, whether it's sort of community assets in Tottenham, whether it's sort of land and housing in sort of Plymouth and Bradford. And I'm sure we'll get into how it works in the future, but I think the sort of key lesson for both of those is that at very different scales, there are already the instruments at play where we can reimagine the future, and it's a question about how we do that together.
Great, thank you very much. And if you are going to demonstrate your jiu-jitsu later, that would be great.
Is that jiu-jitsu? I actually don't know what jiu-jitsu is.
I'm going to turn to Gilda. Firstly, am I pronouncing your name right? Is it Gilda or Gilda? Sorry about this. I just want to make sure.
It's Gilda.
If you would like to just give us a quick intro into kind of who you are and also kind of a bit about your organisation, that'd be fantastic.
Okay, I'm a bit distracted by seeing my enormous floating head dwarfing all of you. I actually have a quite normal-sized head. Anyways, that aside, I'm one of the co-founders of the LA Co-op Lab. We're a very local organization that's dedicated to building the capacity in Los Angeles for the development of worker cooperatives as collective livelihoods. And we do that as one way to push back against the growing inequality in Los Angeles and in the United States, to push back against exclusion and gentrification and displacement in the gig economy. And as the LA Co-op Lab, we are extremely fortunate to be founding members of a national financial cooperative and peer network, of which Susan is also a part, called Seed Commons. And Seed Commons, as a financial cooperative, builds the capacity for all of its members around the country to be able to finance the livelihoods that we help to create, the democratic livelihoods. And so perhaps I should leave it at that.
Great, thank you. We will come back to definitely delving a lot more about the really great work you're doing in Los Angeles and elsewhere. Just moving on to Jero, I think it's a good segue to talk about inequality in LA to inequality here in London and the work you're doing at BD Giving. So yeah, over to you.
Sure. Hi everyone. My name is Jero, and as I'm sure most people might think in the room, I'm not French. I'm from Belgium actually. Been in this country for 10 years and I've stopped trying. I have a different accent. So I'm here to talk to you about Barking and Dagenham Giving. I just wanted to sort of see in the room who knows where Barking and Dagenham is. Could you raise your hand, please? Fantastic. It's a very London-centric audience. So Barking and Dagenham Giving essentially is a kind of place-based organization with social infrastructure. Was set up in 2019 through a collaboration between local authority and the social sector. Tell you a little bit about, I mean, I'm sure most of you know that, but Barking and Dagenham is a very, very interesting place. It's post-industrial, literally post-Fordist. Used to have one of the biggest Ford plants in the world, employing 40,000 people at its peak. It's also one of the most deprived areas of England, unfortunately, I think 12th most deprived, and one of the youngest. But it's got a lot of assets, and it's changing very rapidly. Council has plans to develop 60,000 new homes in the next 20 years. And then you've got the arrival of new industries, creative industries, film. The wholesale markets are moving to Dagenham. You've got plans for free ports as well as a data center. So one of the big challenges for the borough is to create the opportunities for local residents to seize, create this framework for these residents to seize these opportunities. And for us as an organization, we're separate from the council, but we work very closely with the council. We sort of defined our activities around three main lines of inquiry. One is, what's the role of participation in sort of charity or organization governance and funding? And we want to see how, by setting up these participatory processes, we can increase collaboration, increase inclusion, and further social justice. So we've been doing work around participatory grant making, and I know there are some colleagues in the room here who do similar type of work, and we've recently established a community steering group to look at more strategic questions that pertain to the organization. Second kind of line of inquiry is, what's the role of leadership, and how do we support local leaders to have sort of difficult conversations that need to be had to create those collaboration and start to change the system together. We believe that conversation is the smallest unit of change, and so we invest a lot of time in seeing what the kind of skills that people need to really have those conversations, from facilitation, conflict management. And then a third line of inquiry, which I'm going to talk to you more today, is what resources do we need to have to strengthen the local social sector? Barking and Dagenham has a very challenged social sector, which is very much mirrors the state of deprivation that we have in the borough. And so we're looking into what a participatory funding ecosystem could do to sort of strengthen and bring more resilience in the local social sector. So things like grants, investments, wraparound support, and partnership. So those are sort of three main questions, and I'll stop here for now.
Great, thank you very much. Susan, finally over to you. Talk us more about kind of what you're up to.
Sure, thanks so much for having me. I was actually just over in the UK 2 weeks ago, so feels like I'm a little bit back. So my name is Susan Sakash, she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the founding members of a group called Cooperation New Orleans, down in the sort of deep south part of the United States in the state of Louisiana. And we really started our organization as a movement building project back in the summer of 2019. We are a small group of folks who were all interested and had a shared interest in how do we grow and strengthen the cooperative and solidarity economies in our region. And we felt it was really important as we did this work to ground our approach in the needs and experiences of those workers who are most harmed by the dominant industries in the city of New Orleans, in the area, which is a lot of hospitality, tourism, cultural workers, healthcare, and also the issues that really dominate the day-to-day experience of workers, issues like housing, gentrification, exploitative workplaces. So the mission that we operate from is really to develop worker-owned cooperatives and the structures that support the creation of those cooperatives and really having a focus on poor and working class, Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities. New Orleans is a majority Black city, and also a place that has a really rich history of cooperativism in its many kind of forms within the Black community there. And so part of our mission is to kind of really lift up those histories and those practices. So within that work, we operate a community loan fund, which I am also one of the project officers, similar to Gilda with LA Co-op Lab. And we do that work through our relationship with Seed Commons. So excited to talk more about that, what Seed Commons is, how we interact with it. And then in addition, we also look to strengthen the cooperative ecosystem and solidarity economy ecosystem by running things like co-op academies, workshops. We do a lot of political education work. And then on the business side, really doing hands-on relational-based technical assistance work, and doing that really, again, from an approach of connection and relationship with the folks that we are working with who are wanting to create wealth building opportunities for themselves to address the needs in their community. I will stop there and excited to get into this transnational conversation.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And thank you all for being here, because I feel like half an hour isn't going to do us justice to try and cover all the amazing ideas and kind of thoughts so far. I guess if we just start off with you, Matthew, just like, I know kind of the way you operate with like you're doing, you look at it at kind of a bigger, broader institutional level, but then all the way down to the grassroots. Would you be able to just, I guess, provide some, I guess, further colour into how all those different spaces operate within the spectrum? Because I feel like that could be a nice way to start the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of the challenge is how do you connect that sort of systemic level through the meter level down to actual practice and place when you do have, as mentioned, these, the asset manager industry now controls $100 trillion globally. How much does that filter down into sort of seed funding for some of the organisations we've been speaking about today? Almost none at all. But so we do take that sort of structural level, because we do think ultimately, this is money that can be redirected. It's not sort of money that sort of descends from the sky. It's actually our money. It's our pooled pension money. It's our savings very often. So there's potential there to reimagine and to redirect, even at these quite structural levels. But then we think very much that, while building for change at that sort of higher level, you have to try and prefigure sort of right now sort of the changes we want to see, which is where the sort of public commons partnership works comes in. So that's something that we sort of developed in sort of 2018, 2019 with a series of partners, and then have been working with a range of community organisations, practitioners, place-based organisations. And I think the interesting thing with that and about how financial instruments can be used is in some ways the public commons partnership model is not a hard and fast rule. It's about flexibility. It's about sort of being iterative. So some of the sort of organisations are pursuing sort of community business models. Others are more in the sort of traditional sort of registered companies house model. Others are sort of social enterprise in a more classical sense. And I think there is rich pluralism in the sort of forms on the grassroots we organise with. But I think what stands out with all of them is they are sort of starved of capital and the type of capital and the type of terms that is generative and not extractive. And yet, there's this paradox that the world is awash with capital, hence the BlackRocks are growing their assets under management by the sort of scale of billions every week. And yet sort of generative organisations on the ground doing the type of work we desperately need are not seeing any of that. And I think sort of thinking through the barriers and thinking through the type of mechanisms that can connect those tissues a bit more effectively is a big challenge.
Great. I think, Gilda, just to kind of go back to you with the work you're doing around Seed Commons and your involvement there, where it's really about connecting the power of big finance and bringing it under community control. Like how can you give us a kind of flavour of how that works? Because I think that's a really interesting way to try and connect the big with the grassroots and kind of what the learnings have been so far, as well as some of the challenges of that work. Oh, you're on mute, sorry.
Yes, that was my mining demonstration. So I'll try to mix it up between story and structure. And so the story is around the same time that LA Co-op Lab started, I was invited to a gathering of folks from around the country who were doing this kind of work in terms of trying to democratize work, trying to lift up the folks who've been historically excluded in their communities. And it was sponsored by an organization called The Working World. And The Working World started in Argentina as a way to help provide cooperative development support and financing mechanisms to the factory takeovers that were happening during the severe financial crisis that was happening there at the time, and then did some work in Nicaragua and came back to the United States. And instead of, like, in order to build national organization and impact, instead of kind of putting out a shingle in New Orleans and a shingle in, the working world West, the working world Midwest, the working world New Orleans, they actually invited people who were doing the work locally and proposed that we work together to build first a peer network and to learn from each other and share principles, and then to build a financial cooperative, of which the Working World was the first member. And so that actually happened. And as we worked together, we developed a set of principles that are the kind of the ties that bind us across incredible diversity. And those are more interesting in how they're applied in practice. And so the first is like, I don't know if it's the same in the United States, but if you're like in a conventional bank and you're being trained, you're going to learn about the 3 C's of lending, which are like credit history, collateral, and character. And so, like, a lot of the people that Susan and I work with, they don't have good credit histories, at least conventional ones, because they've been excluded from so many vehicles of opportunity. They might not have collateral, but it's probably, I think we share an opinion that it's not entirely moral to take away something that was acquired with the blood, sweat, and tears of a working class individual that we had no investment in. And then finally, character. Character in banking terms doesn't mean the same as character. It used to. It used to mean something having to do with integrity and quality of endeavor. But nowadays it means things like, oh, were you ever evicted? Like, did you ever serve time, et cetera? And all of our people have a lot of character. That's not what they mean. So we subscribe to we call it radical inclusion, which is just the counterpoint. It's kind of like what Susan was talking about, who it is that we work with. The people who've been historically and structurally excluded from benefiting from the true benefits of the economy. And those are certainly African Americans, immigrants, women, just all kinds of people. There's so many different kinds of people. We practice non-extractive financing, and by that we don't ask for collateral. We don't ask for credit histories. We do investigate character as a way that normal people do in terms of developing relationships. And so much of what we're doing has to do with how are we going to restructure relationships in the economy. And so we put a lot of time into, as Susan did, like, in education and training and building together relationships between our smaller local loan funds and the individual teams of folks who endeavor to create collective occupations through worker cooperatives. We put a lot of time into developing business model, financial projections, opportunities, things like that. And from there, we have a diverse loan committee that's made up of member organizations from the Seed Commons Financial Cooperative, myself included. I'm representing the LA Co-op Lab. And that is a phenomenal learning experience, because I can say that I'm always impressed with the different kinds of thinking and questions that my peers apply to a particular loan that's being presented to us. And there seems to be a tendency to not say no to things, because by the time they get to the loan committee, they've already been vetted locally as to whether it's really meeting this particular loan is meeting at least the principles of our organization. But we do go back and forth in terms of further developing ourselves as an opportunity, et cetera. So the other thing that's interesting, and then I will stop talking. But the other thing that's interesting about Seed Commons is the relationship between decentralization and centralization. Like, when is it useful to be decentralized, and when is it useful to be, centralized? What is useful to centralize? And so what's really decentralized is how capital is distributed, and basically where the knowledge of place comes from, and the opportunities for investment come from. And so capital is distributed in a decentralized way. And the distribution is decentralized, and the acquisition is centralized. And there's a fairly refined approach to how capital is distributed, including gift capital, in terms of supporting the local organizations. And in terms of acquiring it, we have staff that's really good at that. And I think we now have a pool of about $40 million that really goes out to projects and people who need it the most. And
Thank you.
I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much. And just Susan, if I could go to you to talk about the Corporation New Orleans Loan Fund. I mean, it would be really, really great to hear more about just, how, not just how that came about, but like the process that went into designing and developing that, kind of what level of code development was there, what learnings were there, because I think this is where rooting it into the practicalities of actually delivering like this in the ground in zero. I think we'll come to you as well on this, but in the hyperlocal sense is really interesting for this audience to hear, because I think sometimes that is the challenge, is that there's this awareness that there's pools of capital available, there are mechanisms, but it's just how do you get to that position where you're actually delivering these kind of financial instruments, which are then redistributing wealth at the local level. So, yeah, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. And as I said earlier, we started initially as really a movement building, loosely affiliated group of people and organizations. But very quickly in our organizing and talking with businesses and workers in our network, is realizing that the largest barrier to moving from like theoretical alignment into practical application really is capital. And in a place like New Orleans, which, after Hurricane Katrina in 2005, there was a flood of philanthropic dollars that came into the city to help rebuild what to rebuild a decimated community. And the funds that came in and the approach that came in was very neoliberal in its vision, and really in terms of how that impacted the small business community and the nonprofit community, was really this almost singular focus on building up the entrepreneurial spirit of the city. Brought in a lot of people who were not from New Orleans. I myself am not from New Orleans, and kind of actually moved to New Orleans to kind of explore what it means when a city tries to rebuild from the outside in, and what the challenges are in that and the harms that can be caused. And so there's a focus on entrepreneurialism, on the individual having their great idea and bringing it into a place, and replicating, a lot of like scaling up, and what we were seeing, in 2019, 14 years after Hurricane Katrina, was a lot of the failures of that mode of operation, and who was excluded, who was harmed by that, from things like how the city was rebuilt in its housing infrastructure, how the schools were privatized and truly failing children, and then the business economy, who was doing well and who was still, suffering under this, what is really an extractive tourist economy. And so we saw that there was a need both for a shift in the kinds of business supports that were offered, as well as in the moving of capital. And, some of us come from a fund development and philanthropic background, but also recognize that that was not the approach to go, because the kind of capital and the way in which capital functions in businesses is at a scale larger than most philanthropic organizations would want to support and are structured really to support. So in that, we just, again, had, through our networks and our relationships, had connections to some of the loan funds that were operating already within Seed Commons, most notably the Southern Reparations Loan Fund, which was a Southern-based loan fund. And so we just put out feelers and were brought into relationship with Seed Commons right at that moment when we were thinking about, it's not possible for us to raise the kinds of funds that we see as being needed locally. But what we know is the biggest barrier is that we're hearing is that capital. But what we did know, and which is what's really, I think, wonderful about the Seed Commons model, is that we have relationships, we have an understanding of what are needs that are not being met by the current markets, by the current economic development initiatives in our city, and where will a relatively small amount of capital really help to shift how businesses can meet on the ground community needs. And so we bring that perspective, those relationships to Seed Commons, which has been, is really where the pooling of resources happens. And it's, I think there's also a synergy happening here of, most of the funds that are raised within Seed Commons are raised from investors, individual investors, families that are looking to shift their wealth out of investments where they maybe don't really have a clear understanding of where those dollars are being invested and held and managed by a fund, into an entity like Seed Commons, which is in itself we call them CDFI, Community Development Financial Institution, that has a different set of metrics that it's looking at, and is really looking at socially responsible investment at the community level. And so there's a synergy of investors and people with wealth who are wanting to move their money into different channels, as well as some philanthropic foundations that are also looking at their own strategies of investment and how can they make a greater shift in how community wealth is developed on the ground. So that kind of coming together and being pooled, those funds, but then the decisions being made at a local
Oh no, we tried to Zoom bug. Just give it a second or two. Okay, I might, Joseph, I might move to you, given that we are talking about hyperlocal, and you set the scene up nicely. You talk about Barking Dagenham and like the kind of place-based approach. I mean, I know the borough well. I mean, I grew up not too far from Barking, and I remember in the 90s, it was a place where we had a far-right council, which is shocking that it's like not so long ago that was the case. But now you've got a very diverse community, a borough in flux, also with all the developments coming through. We will hopefully get Susan back. So it's a great opportunity to talk about, I guess, the work you're doing at the Barking Dagenham. Hi, Susan, can you hear us?
I can, so sorry.
I did move to Giro, but is there anything you quickly wanted to just wrap up on before, or should we go as is?
I think let's go as is, and we can, if we can, I'll circle back to this.
Cool, thank you. Thanks very much. So over to you. It would be really great maybe to start off with to actually talk about your unique funding model as well, because you have quite a specific type of setup.
Sure. I'm just correcting thing. We didn't have a far-right council, but 10 councillors were.
Oh, sorry, apologies.
Yeah.
That's my bad.
So essentially, so I'm here to tell you about Barking Dagenham's Community Endowment Fund, which is emerged from a partnership with the local authority, and a decision that was made in 2020 to transfer approximately £1 million, but then to commit in the long term to transfer more funding into a financial instrument that would be based in Barking Dagenham giving, but ultimately have some sort of control by the local community, or at least be co-designed with the community. And I was reflecting on what's the sort of the where the sort of ingredients of this, of what made this possible for us. And I think it's a story of partnership. I've mentioned it. It's a story of innovative use of creative use of financial levies, and then of patience, a lot of patience. So the council and the social sector have been sort of reframing their relationship for the past at least 5-6 years, following that sort of traumatic experience of having the BNP electing 10 representatives. It knew that it needed to work differently, and then also the austerity context meant that the council wanted to sort of look at how it could work in partnership with the local social sector, as opposed to perhaps in a more kind of paternalistic way, which used to be the way things were done before. And that's been an interesting and quite long process of really rebuilding relationship and trust. And by all means, it's not complete. I mean, but there's been a lot of progress in that space. And with this came the willingness to let the local social sector to experiment and to find innovative ways of funding them. So that's the second point around creative use of financial levies. As I mentioned, there is 60,000 new homes being built in Barking Dagenham, and with every square meter or foot that's being built, there is a levy that developers have to pay to sort of help the community, local community, absorb the effect of those developments. The council was, there's different ways that levy is split, but essentially we're tapping into what's called the neighbourhood community infrastructure levy, which is a little bit more permissive in how you can use that money, whereas the more strategic still is to be spent on infrastructure. But anyway, so that's the kind of technical bit. I think the council made a very conscious decision that they wanted this NCLB, the neighbourhood community infrastructure levy, to be spent all over Barking and Dagenham, just in places where you had a lot of redevelopment, because their fear was like, what happens to the places which are not seeing redevelopment, and how do we make sure that we keep everyone, we give those opportunities for everyone? So that was a very important move. And then the second one was actually trusting an organization like ours to manage what is a considerable amount of money. And that leads me to sort of the third point, kind of, the patience and the trust. I mean, we kind of went in like jolly. We're like, yeah, great. We're, participatory grant making is our thing. We want to do this in a participatory way. Let's work with the community. Let's design an investment policy together. And we sort of convened a first workshop in March last year, quite naively thinking that we would get out with some core principles for our investment policy. And it was a very interesting workshop, but one participant said, when they got out of the workshop, it's great to be invited to the party, but I feel like I've eaten and drunk too much now. and we're like, okay, right, if we're gonna make this any sort of meaningful engagement, and if we're really going to co-design this with our local community, we need to invest more resource and more time in it. Hence the patient bit. So we went out there, recruited 15 people from the local community, mostly women, mostly people of color. They're like mothers, entrepreneurs. They're involved in their community in various ways. They have no financial experience whatsoever, in a professional way, I mean. And then we partnered with an organization called the Curiosity Society, who had experience in that space. And we designed a training program for them. And for us, because I haven't got a financial background either, so I was very interested in learning about how we manage risk, liquidity, return, and so on. And we embarked on a 7-month journey with them. It wasn't like too onerous in terms of time, one workshop every month, 2 hours, but we had like some homework to be done before. And I should mention, everyone was paid for the time because that was quite important. And the meetings were held on Thursday evenings because people have jobs. And so we had to look at after all of these elements, and including doing face-to-face kind of follow-up with each member of the community steering group. This was a really, really fascinating experience. And in May, our community steering group agreed what the investment policy for the charity was going to be. Now remained the easiest bit, sell it to the trustees, right? So we had prepared the grounds, obviously, we had a trustee member on those meetings knowing, what was going to happen. But we had also this very symbolic handover where, charity commission rules are what they are. In the end, trustees take responsibility for, that investment policy and what that money is going to be doing. So they need to approve it and they need to endorse and be responsible for it. So we had that handover being done from the community steering group to the board of trustees. I'm very glad that was approved formally by the board a couple of weeks ago, literally unchanged with what the community steering group said. So a couple of last few things on this. It's really interesting to see that once we put the resources, when we give the support, financial, moral, the time, to community members, the kind of things that they come up with, and the sort of the wiseness that people have, their feeling was that this was the community's money, which is exactly what we wanted. It is Barking and Dagenham's money. We need to make sure that we have the right approach for investing it. Second thing is return is nothing without impact. So it has to be impact first. And hopefully it will be impact. I mean, the policy said it should have impact in Barking and Dagenham. So there will be local investment into local ventures. Not all of it, because we want to learn first. We want to build that ecosystem, build the market as well. But it has to be impact. And the return comes if the return comes. So that's also a very, very different approach, which I think, is the result of working in this way. But we're only there where we are now, and obviously the challenges ahead are massive. And I think that summarizes, as a kind of concluding word on this, our experience, which is we're really building this as we are, this boat as we're navigating, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And in the end, it's all about going back to the values that we embraced when we started, which is, can we actually be radical on this and participatory, and how much can we let go?
Great, thank you. And I've been lucky enough to meet the community group as well in person, and they are a wonderful bunch of people as well. So I could definitely attest to that. I've been given the 5-minute warning, so time does fly. I'm not lying with this conversation. We could probably talk for much, much longer. So I just wanted to quickly go around each of you to kind of, if you were to leave a parting gift for our audience, kind of like in relation to what you're working on, but also kind of the key nuggets that they could maybe take back to the respective organizations or think about after this conference, because this conference should be about ideas and then thinking about what happens afterwards and bringing about some changes. Okay, what would they be? Matthew, if I start with you on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think when it comes to financial instruments, I'd say obsess less about sort of, is there sort of one really great, innately good financial instrument and others that are bad. It's more about the intentionality behind how you're using and deploying that finance or that financial instrument, and the relationships that it's nested in, and the sort of forms of trust and reciprocity that should be built into it. I mean, I think that the second thing is, and it's a fairly obvious point, but just sort of ambition, ambition, clarity and speed, given the sort of the poly crisis piling up all around us, that I think, now really is the time for going big, so to speak. And I think going big isn't the same as just being structural. I think, the key thing for me is we live in some ways in a world of abundance, and we don't need to wait for some sort of technological or technical threshold to be crossed to unlock that abundance. What we need to do is think about how we reimagine the social and financial institutions that currently sort of, put walled gardens around that abundance, and actually break that down and democratize that. And that's sort of the key challenge to me. We have the capacity and the imagination, we just need to sort of cohere them all into sort of unlocking that abundance.
Great, thank you. Jill, if I could go to you for your nugget of wisdom for us in the UK, what would it be?
I guess, so the LA Co-op Lab, like Cooperation New Orleans, also comes out of a movement, and the same kind of elements that allow movements to make change, which I believe are trust and alignment and a long-term view, are the same things that people have been talking about here in terms of how to think about capital. Yeah. And I guess my big message is that this is our moment. There have been times in history when, for example, cooperatives, worker cooperatives, have been much desired and much expanded, and those were during, in the United States at least, during the period of Reconstruction after slavery. During the Industrial Revolution, where artisans were thrown out of work and replaced with sweatshops, during the Depression, when in California over 300,000 people found livelihoods in cooperatives. It's these times when desperate need and mutual aid and democratic endeavor rise up. And this is happening right now. There's this language in the press about, at least in the United States, that is called the Great Refusal. People don't want to go back to work. Amazing. People don't want to go back to shitty jobs. Okay. They've been just confronted with a global pandemic when they're going through your normal life, and all of a sudden there's this phenomena that's going life, death, life, death, life, death, and I choose life, says people, and so we have free office hours. Is a way that we meet people. I enjoy the kind of you don't have to have an agenda to go to our office hours. You can choose your agenda, and they've tripled during COVID for precisely this reason, that chefs who are saying, maybe people think it's adorable to watch on reality shows toxic kitchen culture, but in reality it's toxic, and we don't want to go back to that. And they started a worker cooperative, or so many. And this, I just feel that this is our moment. We need to grab it. I'm so happy to be here with people who have really different experiences than ours, that are closer because of shared principles.
Thank you. That's like an amazing thing to leave us on. And Susan, just very quickly from you, in terms of what we've been discussing about, kind of financial determinants and redistributing wealth, I guess one takeaway from you for all of us, what would that be?
One thing I was just left with was when you have people who are most impacted and stand the most to benefit from shifting their working conditions at the table in thinking about how to make capital available in a way that allows them to see their vision through, they come up with really creative structures and processes and ways of making sure that they can pay that money back. And that's really what Seed Commons is creating, is a creative space of reimagining how capital gets distributed. So bring the people to the table. I love that Gerard's saying they're doing that in participatory grant making ways, and listen. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Joe, finally from you.
So for me, it would be trust the people. That's been said, but embrace the process. I think sometimes it's been presented even in like charitable, fundraising and all that. There's these messages where like, oh, for every pound you give, we will, 98p or something will be given to the cause that you love or you want to support. And I think that hides all of the infrastructure and the people that are actually working to support this specific cause. There is so much value in bringing people around the table, as Susan was saying. And for us, it's the first line of impact. It's actually doing these processes. So I would love if more kind of funders went down that route. And if you don't know how to do it, there are plenty of really great organizations. I know in the US, but certainly in the UK as well, place-based organization, giving schemes. I know Camden is there. There is Plymouth Pub. Go and talk to these guys because they're doing amazing work and they can help you have impact.
Great. I think you're being far too polite because BD Giving is also a vehicle that you can put your money into. So do talk to Giro if you are a funder interested in this work. So I think I'm going to leave it there because I think I've gone well over the 5-minute warning. So apologies. Please don't get mad at me. Thank you all, and thank you to the amazing panel, and thank you to our guests from America. Thank you for coming along.
Thank you so much. That was it's so wonderful to be able to learn across the States and the UK. And I think in so many ways, some of the initiatives we've been hearing about perhaps are showing us in the micro, perhaps what we need more of in the macro. Anyway, lots to think about there. I've got 2 very important announcements. One is for our online partners. Very, very sorry for the glitches. We've had a few glitches there. We are going to need to shut the stream down and restart it. So we're going to do that in the break. So if you could log off and log back on at 4 o'clock, hopefully it'll be a better experience the last bit of the day. Sorry about that. Also, we're just going to make a little tweak to the programme. So we're still going to finish for a break now. We'll come back here at 4, but then what we're going to do is actually bring the last 2 panels together. So we've got 2 more panels today. One looking at progressive wealth stewardship, and one which is being curated by the Grant Givers Movement, looking at power and equity in grant-making practices. We'll bring those together, so we'll run from 4 o'clock, and we will stop at 5:45, and at that point, I'm sure we will all be very keen for a drink, and that's when we'll move upstairs, and please do stay for a drink then. I think that's everything I needed to say. The refreshments and stuff will be outside here again for this break, and if you could be back here by 4, that would be fab. Thank you.